Welcome back. You're watching the Power Breakfast Show live on Citizen TV. We are well into our second hour on this 23rd day of November 2017. Well, during the first hour, we talked a little bit about democracy in Zimbabwe. Now we focus on the continent as a whole. And of course, if you've just crawled out from under a rock, a lot has been happening in 2017. Let me walk you through a little bit about that. Robert Mugabe, Jose Eduardo dos Santos, Yahya Jammeh finally left office, either willingly or unwillingly. Liberia and Kenya went through heavily contested elections, which the former has not fully resolved. And we have issues of term limits, predictability of elections, are they held on the day that they should be or pushed further? And of course, issues of state capture. We've seen all this causing a bit of friction in Uganda, the Democratic Republic of Congo, where we've seen that election being pushed forward, and South Africa, just to name a few. And of course, today, we want to hear from you at home. We're asking you, is Africa getting more or less democratic? Having looked at the events of the last 11 months or so, is Africa getting less or more democratic? Talk to us. 22422 is our SMS line. And on social media, use the hashtag PowerBreakfast. You can tag at Citizen TV Kenya on Twitter, on Facebook, and I'll be reading your feedback throughout the course of this broadcast. Let me introduce my guests here in studio before we take a little bit look at how to define democracy. Let me start from the far right there. We are joined by Daniel Juma, Executive Director, Global Peace Foundation, and political analyst. Welcome to the program, sir.
Thank you.
Right next to him, Dr. Toussaint Kafahire Murhula. I pray I've said that right. A lecturer, International Relations, Hekima Institute of Peace Studies. Forgive me if I butcher your name.
It was perfect.
It was perfect. Good. Thank you. We started the show on the right note. Nakia White, familiar face here, Citizen TV CEO, Global Ladder Africa, and political strategist. Welcome to the program as well.
Thank you for having me.
Shake your hand. You're closer to me than the other two gentlemen. We also will be having Ambassador Yvonne Hamati, Kenya Mission to UN Nairobi, Ministry of Foreign Affairs. She'll be joining us in just a bit. First things first, before you can talk about democracy in Africa or democracy in the world, you need to define it. And in 2004, a lecture at Stanford University came up with 4 key elements that describe a democratic state. If we can have those up on the screen. A democratic state has these 4 key elements: a political system for choosing and replacing the government through free and fair elections, the active participation of the people as citizens in politics and civic life. There are 2 others that we will be taking a look at. Thirdly is protection of the human rights of all citizens within that country. And finally, a rule of law in which the laws and procedures apply equally to all citizens, rich, poor, from whatever tribe, etc. Let me immediately pose my first question to my guest here. Daniel, I'll start with you. Do you agree with those 4 points that describe a democratic nation, or would you like to add or subtract from them?
Yes, I agree. I agree. But then, as you know, democracy basically is power by the people, of the people, by the people. And of course, on the surface, it is assumed that in democracy, power belongs to the people. But more often than not, in Africa especially, power is for the people during elections.
Only during elections.
So after you vote, that's it.
Okay.
Yes.
And then we'll need to talk about how to change that. Dr. Toussaint, your take on that definition, but also your spin on it?
Well, I agree totally with the definition to begin with. But I think those measurements usually can lead us astray, because I have noticed recently, especially when you look at the African context, that people believe democracy is receding the moment we do not meet those criteria or definitions.
Okay.
So what I would say rather is that democracy also focuses on a kind of distribution of wealth, of power, and of worth. So the human dignity, which was represented there as human right, respect for human rights, is very key and very fundamental.
Okay. So you see, distribution of resources should be a key factor in any democratic state.
Economic distribution is really, really important. And I think most people who go to the street to fight for their rights,
yes,
basically it is saying you cannot appropriate the resources of the country alone. You have to redistribute them to allow everybody to have a decent life.
It'll be interesting to see what those who believe in capitalist economies would have to say about what you have to say. But Nakia, as you were talking, was trying to wrap her head around your point and allow her to come in now.
Well, I think, democracy is one of those things. I think it's constantly changing, it's constantly growing. When you talk about the kind of birthplace of democracy in Greece, particularly Athens, you know, it really wasn't a democratic state, as women and slaves were not allowed to vote. So democracy, of course, has, even in the United States, when we look at democracy before the 1960s, African Americans were not allowed to vote, so, or black Americans were not allowed to vote. So I think democracy morphs into different things it evolves and depending on who leadership is. To your point, in terms of, you know, economics being shared, that sounds more like socialism to me than it does democracy. So I don't know. I think some people might debate you on that particular point, but nonetheless, democracy is one of these interesting things that constantly changes, constantly morphs. And in Africa, you have to question whether or not, you know, looking at especially 2017, whether or not democracy actually is useful in a sense where all people are heard. I mean, you come from a situation historically where they're monarchs, basically, right? They're kings of tribes. So, you know, and you juxtapose that against current democracy, and you have to question.
Are you willing to answer that question? Is democracy more useful in Africa right now?
You know, I think in some places it's a negotiated democracy. I don't know if in all parts of Africa where there claim to be democracy that it's really truly a full democracy. Okay, Ambassador Yvonne Hamati now joins us. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
It's good to have you here at early morning, but nevertheless we carry on with the show. I don't know if you've had a chance to just listen to a little bit to what your co-panelists have had to say about democracy, the definition of it. I don't know if you have your own take on what democracy actually means or what you should see in a nation that's democratic.
Well, I think that it has been said before, and thank you very much for having me here, and it's good to see you all. I apologize, we're busy with the inauguration of President Kenyatta. No politics. So. But thank you very much. Thank you. We've worked hard for it. But if we're going to discuss democracy, we're going to have to look at it in the African sense of the term democracy. Who defined democracy? What is democracy? I mean, we came from an era, an African era, where our elders sat and discussed and decided what is good for us as a people, and it worked. Yes. We came from an era where a boat, a ship, someone came to us and gave us Christianity, a Bible, and so on, something else, and defined to us what is Christianity and everything else. But you see, at the end of the day, we are fundamentally African. Right? That's what we are. That's who we are.
What does it mean to be fundamentally African?
It means I am Rwandan. It means I am Zimbabwean. It means I am Egyptian. It means all those things. And the reason I've given those three different cases is this: that in Egypt they went to Tahrir, and we stand with the Egyptian people and the decision that they made. It means in Rwanda they have decided that, you know what, President Kagame should continue because our country is growing, our economy is growing, our people, right, are being taken care of. We are one of the fastest rising economies in Africa. I am Rwandan. In Kenya, I stand as a Kenyan, meaning I've gone for elections. I have won an election. The Supreme Court has decided that we must go back for an election, and I have respected the decision of the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court has come back and upheld my election after the second round. So
it sounds like there are many Africas within Africa itself. You could almost be describing different parts of the world, yet it's the same continent.
Absolutely not. We are, that's what I'm coming to, that we are a unique continent. It's not that we are different. It's just that we play, our rules are different. Okay. Based on how.
I need to interrupt you there because we need to take a look a little bit at what's been happening over the last 11 months or so in Africa. I don't know if we can have those graphics up on the screen. Let's first take a look at nations that witnessed transitions in 2017, and that should be coming up on the screen shortly. We have Zimbabwe, obviously the big story right now. Exit Robert Mugabe, and we expect tomorrow the entry of Emerson Mnangagwa. In Angola, we saw the exit of Jose Eduardo dos Santos, and the entry of João Lourenço, of course, names very difficult to pronounce, but and of course, Jose dos Santos left on his own volition after what, about 38 years or so in office. In Gambia, we saw the exit of Yahya Jammeh and the entry of Adama Barrow, and we all know the story around that and the political agitation in that part of Africa. In Liberia, the transition, and I put a rider there, still ongoing. The exit of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, president, and we're not quite sure who will take over when the dust settles, but they're going through matters there that involve their electoral agency and their Supreme Court as well. And in Somalia, earlier this year, we saw the exit of Hassan Sheikh Mohamud and the entry of Mohamed Abdullahi Mohamed. And I want to come to each of you, and I can start with you, Nakia, on this side, and then head over to that side as well. Which transitions in African countries stood out for you in 2017, and why?
I think Zimbabwe was probably, I mean, most recent, obviously, but stood out for me the most because you have a 93-year-old monarch or dictator that just refused to leave at 93 years old. Who is he refusing to? You know, I mean, it was just, and to see kind of when you look and you read and you see how joyous people are that he actually...
Speaking of the pictures that you have on
the
screen.
Right, exactly. That he was incredibly happy to have resigned or for the military to have taken over. I think for me, Zimbabwe is the one that really stands out. And then the other interesting place is Angola, just to kind of see what's going to happen next. I mean, his daughter, Santos' daughter, has already been fired from one of the most powerful positions, you know, in the government. So
one of Africa's richest women.
One of Africa's richest women, exactly, Forbes, right? So I'm interested to see what will happen with Angola next, but certainly for me, the most interesting is Zimbabwe.
Dr. Toussaint?
Well, just to look at these cases that are being presented, I think Gambia would be the one that fits the most the definition that we provided at the beginning, in the sense that people took it to the elections. Although Yahya Jammeh refused to leave power, but at least the people had a chance to express their will, their volition, if you will. And he refused to step down. So when Senegal or the ECOMOG intervened to help the institutions get strengthened, I believe that's the way to go. In Zimbabwe, I can question actually the democracy because it's the military that intervened mostly to help Mugabe get out of the power because he was becoming just senile. I mean, he could not make right decisions. Someone else was making the decisions on his behalf. When it comes to Angola, also, I think it was Dos Santos himself who decided to step down. So the people to say that they have to take ownership of their history, of their political institutions, is what should make democracy democracy. Maybe just very quickly to come back to some of the definitions that I heard before from my colleagues here. I believe democracy is much more about institutions than it should be about people, individual people.
Okay.
To that extent, I'm kind of coming back to, you know, saying you give one man 20 years in power because he's doing well economically. What says that another person would not step in that position and do even better? So to empower the people to say you can choose with freedom, that's something that we need actually to implement much more and further in any democratic system.
I think you specifically referenced something that Ambassador Hamati was talking about. I'll give her a chance to respond, but first, Daniel, I can come to you. We've looked at several nations that have witnessed transitions. Any that particularly stood out for you as you describe Africa in 2017?
I think, as you have said, Gambia, and now Zimbabwe, and of course Angola, who knew that these countries would experience change in our time. But if you look at Zimbabwe, it's very, very, you know, interesting, because for me it's all about succession maneuvers. You know, so I'm a little hesitant about what's going on there, because it's just about ZANU-PF. You know, these are the same people, you know, who entrenched Mugabe in power. As you know, in 2008, Savingirai actually was said to have won the elections. The same people, Mnangagwa, who actually, you know, entrenched Mugabe in power. So it it is good. Looking at it in our context, something that has a beginning has to have an end. You know, Mugabe was outdoing himself. You know, you cannot be on the dance floor forever. You know, you have to take a rest at some time. But then that tells you that even within the ZANU-PF itself, you know, people are looking for change. So you cannot claim to want to be there forever. So, and then if you look at Gambia, what happened? That's another interesting one. Who knew that the great Yahya Jammeh, the healer, the kind of Messiah, you know, would leave, but finally he was forced out. So what just tells us, and if you see what's going on in Togo today, that for you, Africans need to know when to step out of power. You know, you need to leave power when you're still popular, so that you can be recognized as great leaders like we had Nelson Mandela.
Wouldn't some say, however, that you need to leave power when the Constitution says you should leave? Shouldn't that be the mark, so that everybody, the rules are fair for everyone else? Not, you know, because I could still be popular at 50.
Yes.
You know, that's 50 years of a reign.
Let me just say, you know, constitutions, just like democracy, I look at them as value neutral. You know, democracy is value neutral. You know, what we need is virtuous citizens. You know, especially in our country, we need to have, for it to work, we need men and women of virtue. For it to work, you can have a good constitution, but if you have a crazy leader who misuses that constitution,
like who?
It doesn't work. And I mean, okay, let me.
Once they don't take the interview up, I can now give you a chance to comment a little bit about the transitions that you witnessed, even as you respond to what Dr. Toussaint had to say. You used an example of Rwanda's democracy looks like this. Kenya's democracy looks like this, you know, has a different case altogether. But he says democracy across Africa should be about strengthening institutions. Doesn't matter which country you're talking about. So, but first things first, let's talk about that. The nations, if any, stood out for you before you respond to what he had to say.
Yes. First and foremost, it's about the people. So Rwanda's democracy and their system, it works. Have you been to Kigali recently? Have you seen the entertainment, the tourism, the business model and everything else? It works. I mean, we love it. Kenyans are flourishing in Rwanda. You know why? It works, right? And in fact, we need to borrow a leaf or two. Zimbabwe. Now, I want to talk about Uncle Bob. And I want to talk about Uncle Bob because I think he's absolutely amazing. And I know that this may
amazing in a positive sense.
Well, amazing is amazing.
Amazing is okay. Carry on.
Right? And I want to say this. Uncle Bob is a freedom fighter. Uncle Bob came and led the Zimbabweans, right, through the struggle. He went to prison. He read. He is absolutely brilliant. I think if there's one thing we cannot take away from Uncle Bob, is that he's a brilliant fellow, right? Yes, he may have done his time. Yes, it may be time to go, but he did what he had to do to liberate Zimbabwe. He took the risks that he had to take to ensure that a few black farmers got land. The reason that processions and protests in Zimbabwe were peaceful were not because Zimbabweans are more peaceful than Kenyans, but because Zimbabweans recognize and realize the sacrifices that Uncle Bob and his team made, and that the army and his successor, President-elect, or incoming, on Friday he will be president, recognize. And that's why nobody could touch him and his family, right? And as I said, we must look at different cases in different ways. Unlike Kenya, where we hear, oh, we fought for multipartyism, or in 1963, because we have a new generation of young people that do not remember, do not understand supremacy, white supremacy rule. We have a generation that do not understand that we could not own land. We have a generation that do not understand willing buyer, willing seller.
Okay.
Therefore, everything else that we do is very different. And we look at, therefore, at leaders. you know, from a different perspective.
There's something you said that I need to clarify. You said that the way in which Zimbabweans have conducted themselves over the last couple of weeks, very peaceful, is not because of the nature of their character, but because they recognize the sacrifices that their leaders made. But what does that then say for Kenya, where we see agitation every 5 years? What does that say about Uganda, where we've seen a lot of agitation over the last couple of months? Do people not recognize what Museveni did for them when he came from the bush and cleared previous regimes?
It talks of a larger youthful population where unemployment is a big issue that needs to be addressed, right? It talks of leaders who can very easily mobilize people, and people are not mobilized because of a belief system. The people that we see causing rioting and looting, these are people that have been paid to go out there, and these are people that are using the opportunity of being on the streets not to push for social change or social justice. But
I'm not sure I buy into that argument across Africa.
No, we are talking about Kenya. You discussed Kenya, so I'm discussing Kenya.
Okay, but I also
for
that,
on Kenya, I'm going to go to Uganda.
Briefly, please.
And so for Kenya, that is an issue, and we know it, and we see
that is your belief.
Because we know when we have peace and when we have quiet. And I think Zanzibar is a wonderful place for us to take a lot of politicians, you know, especially when we need peace. But
we agree we're not getting into local politics.
But let's go to Uganda.
One second, please. I need to give my other panelists time. Okay, you can go ahead.
I want to go to Uganda. Uganda also is a special case because remember, in Uganda, it has had the longest struggle with rebels, longer than any other country in Africa, right? And they're in northern Uganda. And therefore, also, the leadership has to deal with that. So it's a very sensitive combination of democracy, autocracy, and everything else.
Nakia here is itching to get in, so I'll have to interrupt you there.
I'm sure.
We have a second graphic that we need to put up. Can we have that up to take a look at nations that witnessed political agitation in 2017? We've looked at transitions, but now let's look at nations that witnessed political agitation. We've talked about Uganda. Okay, I'm told we don't have that right now. Nakia, come in. I'll pick that up shortly. Go ahead. I know you wanted to respond, and you had your own thoughts as well.
Well, listen, I think, you know, Africa can't be, I think it would be a huge mistake to see Africa as a monolith, as one-dimensional.
Okay.
I think Africa, depending on where you go in Africa, different political systems, different political situations, different political leaders, mindsets, cultures, thoughts. And so, because it is so multi-dimensional, I think it's hard for us to kind of plate cast a particular area for one thing or another. So I would have to disagree with you on that. And in saying that, you know, the way that people protest is if we're talking about democracy, is a democratic right. So everyone has the right to protest. Violent protest, I don't support. I think violent protests have no particular usefulness in moving an agenda forward. But protest is certainly part of the democratic process, and what Zimbabweans protested about was certainly a much more peaceful way than we saw here in Kenya. But again, it is all part of democracy, right? If you're going to be a democratic state, this is part of it, you know, free speech, protesting. So I would challenge anyone to say that Africa is a monolith one, and that, you know, the way one person protests versus another is wrong or right under democracy. You don't have to agree, right? But under democracy, everyone has the right to protest.
Okay.
But what is democracy?
I don't want us to get lost in protests in democracy, because I believe there's so much more. Dr. Tusan, let me change gears just a little bit and come to you now and try and figure out, is Africa's failings or perceived failings when it comes to democracy a result of trying to directly import Western democracy to Africa and then try and download while the structures are very different? What would you have to say about that?
That's a very good question to begin with. First of all, I want to say that I disagree with this notion of African exceptionalism. where Africa has to invent its own model of democracy.
Oh, so you disagree with our title there, Democracy Made in Africa. That's what we have on the
well, we should begin from there, I believe.
Okay, carry on.
Democracy is a universal value. And I think actually the moment we began by a definition, that definition should fit people whether you are black or white, woman or man, Christian or Muslim. So it's a universal definition. I think it was in the late 90s that someone like Amartya Sen, whom you might be familiar with, Nobel Prize in Economics in 1998, I believe, was asked by some journal in Japan about what is the greatest achievement in Africa, in the world for the 20th century. And he said, you know, I have no difficulty saying it is the rise of democracy as a universal value. People should remember actually that in Africa in the 50s, 60s, 70s, democracy was nowhere or under the radar of the discussion and debate. And only in 25 years, last 25 years, African countries now have taken democracy to be part of what make their makeup, so their fundamental rights. So that being said, I believe actually that Africa is really democratizing. Democracy is not failing, it is not receding in Africa. On the contrary, democracy is really on the rise, because if African countries have been able to accomplish in 25 years this much, I mean more than what many other countries needed centuries, millennia to achieve, I think we should give democracy in Africa credit. Okay. And again, as I was saying before, it all depends on the very basic definition that we want to provide to democracy, which in my case, it is really participation of citizens, participation in the sense that you are sharing power. No one single person should monopolize power. In politics everywhere, it's always fighting about power. It is also, as I was saying, about the distribution of worth, human dignity, and it's also about the distribution of wealth, which is not necessarily the socialist way of thinking about distribution of wealth, but what opportunities are there for people to say, because I've been empowered, I can compete at equal footage with
power, worth, and wealth. Daniel, before I come to you, I think those graphics are now ready. Nations that have witnessed political agitation in 2017, let's have those up on the screen. Uganda, opposition legislators this year put up quite a fight, some would say a futile fight, however, to counter Museveni's plan to abolish presidential term limits. DRC, political agitation over elections, and we are now told the election will happen in 2018, if that will still be the case, extending Joseph Kabila's term as head of state by a year. South Africa, we know that President Zuma has been accused of trying to influence independent institutions to cover up for his alleged sins. Again, still part of the whole democratic process. In Nigeria, we had a head of state who has been constantly taking medical leave but refuses to resign, and there are many who ask, you know, in a democratic state, you should easily leave that office and leave someone else to carry on. Again, it is right, so it's debatable. In Kenya, 2 disputed elections, depending on which side you support, 2 Supreme Court petitions. Okay, that is clear for everyone. And of course, we've been in the headlines around the world. Kenya, a big talking point. And in Togo, we all know about demonstrations urging the end of a 50-year dynasty by the Nasingbe family. 50 years that family has ruled Togo, and now people are saying enough is enough. Daniel, I can now come to you.
Yeah, thank you. The system that we have today is basically a colonial legacy, I can say. You know, everything we have in Africa.
Hangovers.
Yeah, you know, we inherited all our systems from Kenya. We inherited from the British. So, I think as a country, and many nations in Africa have been grappling with how to be able to implement democracy. But you know, the way it is being done sometimes in Africa is not the way it should be done universally. For example, if you look at democracy in the United States, for example, look at the way they conducted their elections. You know, it was very competitive, like we had it here. But in Kenya, it's always life and death, and every 5 years we experience these kind of you know, problems every 5 years. So sometimes you wonder, is it working for us? And for me,
as Kenyans or as Africans?
Yeah, as Kenyans. Sometimes I caucus with Kenya Daima, which is a part of KEPS, the business community, and we have learned that we lose a lot of business, a lot of billions every election year. So then you wonder, then are we better off with, for example, a monarchy like the UK? You know,
that's actually one of my questions. That was actually one of my questions. Just to interject.
Yes.
There's an article that I read online that proposed let's give up on democracy in Africa.
Yes.
It's a dangerous experiment that too often goes wrong, because they say that it is in years like the one that we've had in Kenya that elections have encouraged corruption, exasperated ethnic tensions, etc. So if that is the end effect of elections, which is part of a democracy, then maybe some would say that let's go a different way. And I guess, is that the argument you're trying to advance?
But then look at...
But do you believe that? Even as you give us your argument?
Even before I say that, you know, we are a British colony. We were a British colony. So we inherited the British system. But as you can see, the British itself is a monarchy. Is a monarchy, and right now as we're talking,
part monarchy.
It is a democracy.
It's a democracy, but part monarchy. Yeah. So what we're grappling with, for example, is a mixture. You know, the British maintained the parliamentary system of government, but right now we moved from that, from 2010 constitution to quasi-presidential. So now we're grappling with the presidential system, which is American, and yet we have been brought up in a British system. And that's why, for example, I'm one of those guys who believe that
this is the part I wanted to hear.
This system that we inherited, from we copied from the US, may not be the best for us. It may not be the best, because
what is the best for us? Sorry, I know.
I'm a believer. I'm a believer that parliamentary system would be much better for us as a country. Because this is
where the leader in parliament then becomes the prime minister,
exactly,
the majority party.
It's still democracy, though.
Yes, but it's still democracy.
Okay, come in, Ambassador.
Thank you. I still want to beg to differ, because you see, my friend here. Sorry. Yes. Discuss democracy, and that democracy is democracy by any other name, whether it is Islam or Christianity. I'm a wife of a Muslim. Let me tell you, we had to agree that no other three people are coming behind me. That may be democracy at home, but the law is very clear, right? According to that, they can be four. Christianity, it's very clear on how it is. African democracy, it depends where you are, where you're coming from. It depends on the number of tribes, the culture, and everything else. It's not a one-size-fits-all.
Is that how it should be?
I have been ambassador of Kenya. I've been to Ethiopia and the African Union. And I think I have done and traversed maybe 50 African countries. I don't know where I haven't been, in maybe Sahrawi, and which I am going to go to next year.
Okay, so give us your plan. Carry on.
Right? And in our similarities, the differences are also very clear. And we cannot then afford to give ourselves one way to manage and rule ourselves. What works, again, I will repeat, in Rwanda, does not work in Kenya. But it works perfectly well there, right?
So should that remain? However, you're describing what we have right now. I don't think anyone disagrees that.
I think what should remain, what needs to happen, is an introspection of people in terms of who and where we are as a society. In Kenya, for example, the truth of the matter is, even if the Supreme Court said that go for another election and go for a rerun or go for a runoff or go for another election, Uhuru Muigai Kenyatta would emerge winner. Why? Is it democratic? Maybe not, according to some people. But he has the numbers. So now, knowing this, as Kenyans, how do we want to define our democratic model to ensure that everybody is included in the governance structure? Because democracy means one person, one vote. Those are questions that we must ask. And I believe that President Kenyatta, in going forward, is going to start looking at inclusivity, right? Healing, reconciliation, and looking back at how we ensure we bring everybody in. Because it's not going to change.
I come from Raila Odinga's home. Let me tell you. Let me put it this way, right? I come from Kavirondo, but we didn't register. Bondo, which I believe is where he's from. Yes, I'm half from Bondo. Okay, sorry. I have one parent from Bondo, the other from Kakamega, and that's why I'm telling you. I come from, but we did not register. I come from the second largest
county in this country. We did not register to vote. Even if we protest every single day, and I keep telling my people, nothing is going to change because we don't have the same numbers. He won the election. Now, how do we change that, right? And to change that, it means we must look back at what we call democracy, that we popularly believe that came from the UK, and not even from the US, because I don't think they do, looking at the fact that...
You don't think they do what?
Believe in democracy. Hillary won, and Trump is president.
But their system...
Yeah, we have
and that's why I'm saying we must look at our system of democracy. That's exactly what I'm saying. And let me tell you, Trump is the legitimate president of the United States of America, right? Yeah. As Uhuru is the legitimate president of Kenya. Now, so the question is, are we going to sit down and look at our system to see how to ensure we include and not exclude, and that everybody feels that they are part of Kenya? Because right now, if people want to discuss secession, right, it will just be one part of the country where I come from, and I ain't going nowhere, man. I am like...
Although opposition MPs would disagree, but because they are not here to respond, so that's why
No,
okay, but South Africa?
I'm speaking also on their behalf, because I come from there.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Not because I support what they do, and I'm not boycotting or resisting, but because I come from there. I'm not going to leave, you know, in South Africa.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador.
South Africa, where we have a party system.
Okay, okay, I need to be fair.
Yeah.
I can't come in, then I come to you.
Yeah.
Very good.
So let's talk about the United States first. And you talked about Trump, and I'll keep my comments to myself about the President of the United States. But the way in which he was voted in, so we have an electoral system and a popular vote. Yes, Hillary won by popular vote, but Trump won by the electoral system, as Al Gore won by popular vote a couple of political seasons ago. So, I mean, the way that the system runs in the United States is very different than it was here. Here is a simple majority. You 50 plus 1, and you win the presidency. So clearly, when we look at the numbers, if we looked at everything, we know that Uhuru Kenyatta at this point is president because he has the numbers. And if we depended on the numbers from the IEBC, we would know that first and second election he won both elections. So, and you know, of course, that's been disputed for a number of different reasons. But in terms of democracy, I do think that democracy, I think one of the panelists mentioned it earlier, I think it really does depend, and you mentioned a parliamentarian type of government. I think a mixed government is probably something that might work in different parts of Africa, maybe not all of Africa, but I certainly think that in the countries that are listed as democracies, I think it's a negotiated democracy. I think, you know, the leaders and the oligarchs, if you will, take pieces of democracy that work for them and implement it, but I don't know if we have a true full democracy throughout any country in Africa.
Even as you respond, there are things I want you to weigh in on. Number one, how can we design democracy so that it better fits African realities? And secondly, how do we design political systems in such a way that they minimize the risk of democratic disaster? So even as you respond, if you can find time to comment on those 2 points as well.
Okay, very quickly. First of all, I think just to be fair with history, one of the best, like the most beautiful moment in Kenyan democracy was the decision that the Supreme Court took to send, you know, people back to the court. Yes, not only Kenyans, but the rest of Africa celebrated that moment. Why? Because
I'm not sure all African leaders celebrated that moment.
Maybe not leaders, but Africans.
And Africans, okay.
Why was that so? Because it showed the power of institutions over the power of a single person. That being said, I think what we're trying to address here, or the ways that we're trying to tackle the issue of democracy in Africa, we're looking rather at the symptoms of the disease, I mean what went wrong, or what is going wrong with democracy, instead of really making the right diagnosis of what democracy should be. And this is why every time that people come together to discuss such an issue, we have really to have an operational definition upon which we agree. The definition that was provided was very, very good.
So can we have that definition up on the screen? It was the first slide, even as you keep talking.
Okay, very good. Simply to say, when we're talking about democracy in Africa, it is very, very critical that we understand it is taking the power back to where it belongs, to the people. Sovereignty in any power, and when you look back at the history of democracy itself, even the West itself is not a model of democracy, and I think Nikia was saying it has been evolving and changing. It was not until, say, the 18th century that democracy moved away from a small group of property owners to say we can expand it to the rest of the citizens. It was not until the 20th century that the women started to vote in the US even, which is a strong democracy. It was not until the 1960s that African Americans started to vote in the US, which is still considered to be a strong democracy. So that being said, I believe Africa is trying to find its own voice in the whole of democratic system, and to just reduce democracy to one person, one vote is too reductionist, I would say. It is not only by casting the ballots that you are giving the power to the people, because people need to be educated. People need to vote with freedom. People need to know, why am I choosing this leader over against the other one? Okay, it should not follow just the ethnic lines. It should not follow the what Africans sometimes tend to push as a real model of democracy, because democracy for me is when you recognize that every single citizen or individual has rights that cannot be overridden. I mean,
why has it taken so long for your form of democracy, or how you see democracy, to set in Africa?
Well,
you're painting us a utopian picture, but we know that's not the reality.
It is not utopian. What I'm trying to say here, it is achievable in the sense that in the 70s, as I was saying, or the 80s, most African citizens did not even have a voice. The simple fact that Africans now know we can take it to the street. Okay. It means we know we have rights that we can go and claim when the institutions are not providing for them.
Okay, I have to interrupt you there. Yeah. Daniel, come in.
For me, this democracy and, to be specific, elections should be about the people. It must be about the people. And I think our biggest problem in Africa, and especially Kenya, has been elections. Because elections should be able to help us to be to get the leader that has the popular mandate. But if you look at our electoral infrastructure, especially in Kenya today, though it's arguable, it depends on which political side you're coming from, but our electoral system today is one that can be easily exploited by the government in power, by the incumbent. So let's agree. So, for example, today, Jubilee is happy with the IEBC, But let's say today, I keep asking guys, what if Raila Odinga was the president?
What message did you hear from the Jubilee side then?
Exactly. So the thing is, when the shoe is on the other side, but the thing is, whoever is in power today, and for me, I've been saying that I think it is time to change our system of governance. For example, I've been thinking, can we have 1 7-year term so that we don't have to go back to elections after 5 years? Because I can tell you,
1 7-year term, yes, non-renewable.
And it is done in Korea and some other countries. Because, why am I saying this? Because in Kenya and in other African countries, when you're the president, you control everything, the state machinery. So IBC may be there and would like to appear independent, but the truth of the matter is that they owe allegiance to the state.
The check.
You get my point? So the thing is that even if it was, if Raila was the president today, for example, do you think he would, knowing that he knows where the right buttons to step and he knows how to control the system, do you think he would volunteer the presidency just like that?
Well, he's not here to respond to you.
So I'm just giving an example.
Okay.
But the thing is, that's why I said earlier on, is that it's about we need people of virtue to make democracy work. Kenyans themselves, we are terrible people.
Those who on the other hand,
we cut corners.
That you cannot guarantee that you will always have people of virtue, but the system should work to keep in check everyone, whether of virtue or not. So I don't know whether, are we going to have to wait in Kenya until the day when people of virtue come to then say that democracy is working?
But look at the system. Like, for example, when the Supreme Court ruled, to annul the election, who knew it would happen?
Yes.
So that actually showed that actually it is possible to get men and women of virtue in Africa.
However,
now let me just mention about the IBC. Because I've had several meetings with the IBC during the elections, and the thing is, even when you look at the chairman of the IBC, he's a good man, but I thought he was a little bit politically naive because he was being pushed by these sides, Jubilee, NASA, and at some you could see someone who was.
He's supposed to be independent.
Yeah, he's supposed to be independent, but
pressed on every side.
Even from the word that came from him, showed that he is not at peace with himself.
Okay, our time is not on our side. Ambassador Yvonne, come in.
Thank you very much. First, I'm actually saddened that when we're looking at our definition of democracy, that what we have on the screen is a definition from somebody from Stanford University. Because what on earth do they know about us here? My father was a historian, and he says we must write our own stories. We must tell our own tales. We must tell our own cultures. And the minute we learn to understand that, then we will be able to define the African democratic perspective and position. And I think that is very important and extremely important. So Stanford, Yale, Harvard, name it, Oxford, very well, but please just stick to...
But we benchmark with them. We say we want University of Nairobi to be like this.
Only you, I know.
Okay, only me.
And maybe you.
Maybe me, carry on.
Some of us, we don't. Some of us, like Mugabe, we went to study there and came back and then changed it to our own perspective. So that is one. But then again, in terms of democracy, what we need in Africa is equity and not equality. Right? Because we need to recognize our differences, our difference in terms of tribe, in terms of culture, in terms of religion, in terms of gender. Remembering who we are as a people. We are very different. You can't say that we are the same as Americans or the Brits or the Canadians. We're not. We're not going to be. I can never be English or Canadian or British or Japanese for that matter. Can you imagine Japan giving me citizenship? When we realize
some of us, why not? But carry on.
But they won't. When we realize that we are innately African,
that conception
and that
of
we are there. No. Africa is Africa. There's no outside Africa or people of African descent, including Brazil and so on and so forth. People of African descent, then we shall be able to figure out where we are and what we need to do as people. I'm not going to live on McDonald's. I want pounded yam and I want my okra and everything else. Yeah?
Okay.
So that's what it is. On IEBC,
need to get a closing comment here because our time is up.
IEBC and allegiance. IEBC is Raila's baby. Let him carry the cross.
Again,
Supreme Court.
How do you justify such a statement? This is an
because when the country, because you were there in this country, unless you are in Japan, when the country was making changes to the Electoral and Boundaries Commission, he was in office, and one of the things that was done was picking new people. Now we've gone along with everything they've done. The government today went along even with the Supreme Court of Kenya and the statement that they made. And let me tell you, we were not happy, right? But we respected the rule of law. So democracy is about respect. If there's one angle of virtue of democracy, that we must agree to is respect of rule of law.
Fair enough.
And that one, we are there. And
okay. Let me interrupt you there. Let me get a final comment from Nakia. Dr. Toussaint, Daniel, you'll forgive me for today. Our time truly is up. Okay. Nakia, just wrap this up for us.
So, democracy in Africa is, Made in Africa is the title of the show today. So you have to really question whether or not democracy works. We have the 3-4 intelligent panelists and certainly a very intelligent host.
Oh, thank you.
And so
you try.
We really, we really have to question whether or not, and I think these are the questions that are being presented today, whether or not democracy works, whether it's a negotiated democracy, whether it's a parliamentarian democracy, a direct democracy, whatever democracy you say, you have to ask if it works, and the question of it becoming equitable and equal, are synonymous actually. So, is it an equitable and equal society where everyone has a voice, where everyone gets the same thing? If that's a democracy, that is also socialism, and I don't know if socialism and democracy are,
social democracy.
So, right, social democracy. So, it's not Greece. So, but I do still think that there are a lot of questions around whether a Western system implanted into the continent of Africa works necessarily all the time.
Okay. Thank you for that. And that's how we wrap up this discussion. Do we have 30 seconds to look at who remains on the list of long-serving rulers in Africa now that Robert Mugabe has exited?